There we go. All right, well, hello everybody. Thank you for joining IFMA Central Iowa chapter for our lunch presentation today. It will be about indoor office environment and carbon dioxide. Let me do a quick introduction of Chris Nelson. He is a mechanical engineer at Shive-Hattery. He's also the building team leader in our Des Moines office. Chris is very active in his community for the last 30 plus years. He's active in Rotary, West Des Moines Chamber, ASHRAE, his church. He also loves to kayak and has done lots of events with that, as you maybe read about in the bio. So Chris has also told me that he wants this presentation to be interactive. So if you have questions as he goes along, please feel free to jump in and just interrupt and ask questions. And yeah, with that, I'll just let Chris take it over.
All right, thank you, Lisa. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah.
All right, welcome everybody. The presentation today is on the indoor office environment. And just again, I think to repeat some general housekeeping, if you have a question, please feel free. Maybe the easiest thing is to write it, put it in the chat box. Lisa will monitor that and can slow me down, stop me, or if you want to just put your video on, that's fine too. I do know that during the pandemic, if there's one thing we've learned, that 50% of our communication, while we've known that for a long time, comes in the way of visual. And I'm just fine if you want your videos on. If you don't and you're eating, I understand that too. So let's talk about this. This is really a bigger part that has to do with a lot of other components as well. But CO2 is what we're going to focus on. I do have to tell you, I might be a little clumsy, believe it or not, on Zoom because I do a lot of stuff in Teams. Bear with me as I, here we go. Give you an idea what to expect today. We will talk about that virus, but I don't want you to think about it as necessarily COVID-19. I'm sorry, I thought we were all over with it. But we really, it still applies in so many different ways. Even to bacteria infections and so forth. The indoor office environment is going to get more and more attention, and having an indoor office environment that is considered to be safe is going to be something. It's going to be a player here in the future if it isn't already, from wherever you're joining us. We're going to talk about outdoor air versus indoor air. And I don't want to take it lightly that the outdoor air here in the Midwest, in the Des Moines area, is clean. We are very fortunate. Some countries, some places of our country, the outdoor air is not a good baseline. But in our case, we're going to be talking about it as a baseline for what is considered to be a great environment. We'll spend a lot of time talking about CO2 monitoring. That's where a majority of this presentation is about. And at the end of the day, I just really want you to feel comfortable with understanding what CO2 readings can mean. If you're walking through if you're walking through a building and you're taking CO2 measurements, I just want you to be very confident in what it really means. We'll spend a little time on filtration. I would love to spend more. It's not going to be in the cards today. Filtration is important. There's so many different types of filtration that can help and improve the environment, but we'll save that for another time. Layered risk reduction strategies. If you Googled this today, you're going to find a wealth of information. There's a video you can listen to that's over 2 hours. It has this featured speaker, Dr. Richard Corsi. He is the Dean, College of Engineering and Computer Science in Portland, Oregon. And he just does a phenomenal job of taking you into the weeds and really letting you understand the science behind CO2 and how it can be used for monitoring. That presentation that he did was back in November of 2020. And so he basically, he kind of wrote the book on where we're going with this. Great source of information. Those first 3 items, we look at the 7 components here. Reducing the source, I just want to let you know that that's the dose, that's the point of contamination. If it's me with a cold, I have a dose and I am the dose. We'll talk about, we're not going to talk about masks any more than we need to right here. I think we've all sort of become opinionated and have our ideas on what masks do and don't do. But here's the third thing on social distancing. That's something we've, have become accustomed to and understand a little bit more than we did before. These three things now: ventilation, filtration, and making use of time. That's where we're gonna spend more of our time. Of course, just education is part of this series right now. Talk about the virus. There's one slide on this. I just want to tell you that I am not an expert on viruses. I don't pretend to be. But we've all gotten there a little bit over time, last couple of years. But a virus needs to be embedded in particles, and it's usually up to about 10 microns in size. And 0.1% of the virus of the virus mass is actually infectious. Cleaning carpets, by the way, reintroduces particulates into the air and is at a much higher rate than you do with hard surfaces. So you just want to be aware of some things like that. That's not most of what we're talking about. People are the emitter. They are the dose. We talked about that just a little bit, but I do want to go down to that third bullet point item: talking loud and talking soft. I will give you, talking loud has been very well demonstrated that talking loud, shouting, it's not as bad as sneezing in somebody's face, but it does cause you to emit particulates at a higher rate. I will give you my personal opinion. When you go to a wedding reception, and I don't know why, I'm just going to be very specific, and you're sitting next to somebody and the music's loud and you are shouting at them, I think that's probably puts you in the highest risk of most things that you associate with, even in the office space. That's how important it is, or how effective it is to not talk loud in those spaces. Viruses, they need a host. They need someplace to live. And again, people are the host. You reduce, and you have the opportunity to reduce that inhalation by dose by keeping by social distancing. Rebreathe and fraction rate. I want you to be very comfortable with the word rebreathe. It's called, when we give it a percentage, it's the percentage of air that you rebreathe of somebody else's air that we inhale. And I want to kind of clarify that a little bit more. It could actually even be your own. It could be the air it could be your own air as well. If you sit in a small telephone booth without a lot of ventilation in there, you stand a good chance of rebreathing. You'll rebreathe your own air. Your percent rebreathe fraction rate will go up. We'll talk a lot more about that. All right. What can we do to reduce our transmission in the workplace? Obviously, the distancing and disinfectants, and then reducing the dose, again, through distancing, filtering, and ventilation. And that's what a lot of what we're going to talk about. What can we use to measure the rebreathe rate? I want you to think about this in terms of, you're walking through a facility and you're trying to figure out, we'll be very careful to use the word safe because it really doesn't apply here, but you want to try to figure out the rebreathe rate. There's one thing that really, really works well and stands out well. That's carbon dioxide. And I'm going to take you back to 9th grade science class for a little bit, and we're going to have to just look at the atmosphere. We're going to just look at the components of what it looks like in our atmosphere today. If you have kids, you can go home and test them, because now you know, or you're reminded, that nitrogen fills up about 78% of our atmosphere. And I'm talking atmosphere within sea level plus or minus 3,000 feet, mostly plus. And oxygen at about 21%, argon at 0.9%, and then you have the other gases and carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide, remember, is the feature for today. Look at how little carbon dioxide there is in our atmosphere. Very, very, very small, almost trace amounts in a sense, but it's there. Now, the next thing we need to look at is what do these components look like when we're breathing? Because if we're going to walk through a facility and we want to find out whether or not this facility has a lot of breathers, or if we're getting enough fresh air, or if this air in our facility at all corresponds to what the outdoor atmosphere looks like, well, let's look at that carbon dioxide a little bit closer. So the air we breathe looks like this. Nitrogen, we bring that into our lungs. We take it back out at 78%. We don't do anything with nitrogen. Nitrogen and argon are both inert gases, while nitrogen is mostly inert under most conditions. But nitrogen and argon are inert. We're not doing anything with them in our lungs. Our bodies have no use for them. The other, if you look right next to nitrogen or between them, you have oxygen. Coming in our bodies at 21% on the left-hand side of that bar chart and being exhaled at 16%. That tells you that shows you we're using about 5%. Now, I want to take for a second and let you know that if you wanted to inside a building, inside a conference room, inside anywhere, if you wanted to put an oxygen sensor in there, that would be another determination of how much air is being breathed. If you're breathing a lot, that oxygen level is going to go down. We use that a lot more in industrial facilities than and actually, I can't say that we've ever done it in an office building, but you could use an oxygen sensor. Why don't we use that? Why would we use a CO2 sensor? Because the difference is only about 25% max. You're going to go from 21% to maybe 20%, maybe 19%. That little incremental difference is very hard to measure. Let's move our eyes to the far right-hand side of the screen where it says carbon dioxide. Now look at the incredible difference there. It's inhaled at 0.03, 0.04% and comes out of our bodies at 4%. That, if you notice the note on the right-hand side, is 100 times the increase. So if we want something that's a little bit easier to monitor, a little bit more accurate, we use carbon dioxide. That's the only reason. Again, look at your 4 components here. You could measure it, and it wouldn't make any sense, nitrogen, not argon. Oxygen would be another opportunity. As we look at carbon dioxide, I also want to point out that there's a lot of carbon dioxide is all around us, obviously. Dry ice is a solid form of carbon dioxide. If you take dry ice and put it in a bucket and take a match and drop it down in there, it's going to go out. There's no oxygen left in there for that match to burn. Carbon dioxide is heavier than air. Just to give you an idea, carbon dioxide, if you were in Arizona and there's a lot of abandoned mines there and you went down deep, the danger going to, well, there's a lot of dangers in there. One danger would be that it's filled up with carbon dioxide. That's more in coal mines than it is. Probably Pennsylvania would be a better example. But carbon dioxide can fill up those mines and you will literally suffocate because there's no oxygen. So know that carbon dioxide is used as fire extinguishers. So we use them to put out fires, if that makes sense. So I just want you to think about carbon dioxide in a lot of different areas. For the most part, we don't want to think of it as a dangerous gas, but where it's completely displaced oxygen, that's when it gets to be dangerous. This kind of repeats pretty much what we talked about. I'll draw attention maybe to the major air pollutants. The EPA has identified carbon monoxide. Just want to be clear that it's carbon monoxide, nitrogen dioxide, ozone, sulfur dioxide, and PM 2.5, PM10, lead. These are things that the EPA has identified as major air pollutants. Carbon monoxide is toxic. That will kill you. Well, again, if it displaces oxygen, it can kill us. But CO2 is not typically considered a contaminant. I want to be pretty clear too that there was a lot of damage done in Mississippi last year, I believe, when a carbon dioxide, carbon sequestration. Well, actually, I don't remember what the pipeline was for down in Mississippi, but it was under high pressure and it blew up. The complications that happened down there with CO2 were that it just displaced so much oxygen, and so people were passing out as a result of that. And then first responders came in and removed people. But just know that that's the same CO2 we're talking about. All in the same CO2 we breathe out of our bodies. So let's look at parts per million. I'm going to introduce that as a way for us to measure. I was saying 0.03% is the outdoor air. Now I'm going to tell you that if you were to take a carbon dioxide sensor and if it read 400 parts per million, you would be reading pretty much the equivalent of what outdoor air is in Iowa. it's a benchmark. I want you, we'll be using this several times over and over. 1,000 parts per million used to be a reference point in DDC systems for HVAC systems. We would just simply use that as monitor. And if it ever got to 1,000 parts per million, we would, we might set up an alarm, but it really wouldn't be till about 1,200 parts per million. And then at 1,700 parts per million, we would alarm a conference room. Why a conference room? Why do they get a higher alarm level? Because we have a higher density of people in there, but usually for 2-3 hours, and then there's a break or something like that. So that's where some of those levels come into play. 5,000, usually high, but you'll see this again too. But it is, according to OSHA, permissible. That's the maximum permissible level on a daily basis. 40,000, usually immediately harmful, but that is, again, due to oxygen deprivation more than is anything CO2 does to you. I want to be pretty clear about this now after talking about CO2 is not an indicator of contaminants in the air. If you walk into a space and you have I've got a CO2 sensor with me. If you've got a CO2 sensor like this and it starts reading, right now this one's reading 849. If it's reading 2,000, if it's reading 3,000, I don't want you to think that it tells you what the contaminants are in the space. It's telling us what kind of breathing rate we're dealing with in the space and our percent and our chances of rebreathing some of that air. CO2 is not related to the virus or bacteria growth that is present in the air. If you see something, if you walk through a space and you have a CO2 sensor that reads 2,000 parts per million, it doesn't mean that it's dirty air. It's easy to start thinking of it in terms of safety, but I just want you to be really cognizant of the fact that it's how much air is being rebreathed and how far away we are from 400 parts per million, which is outside air. It's not necessarily a measure of safety. You could argue that if you said, did you watch the Apollo 13 movie where CO2 became an issue? And yes, that you cannot put 3 people in a lunar module that was designed for 2 people without having some issues with CO2. And they fixed it by bringing in another CO2 scrubber from the command module. Therefore, if you look at CO2 and the correlation of the breathing, that's what we really want to, we just want to keep that in mind all the time. CO2 monitors are relatively cheap. However, some of them are inaccurate. I'm going to show you mine that, and I got online to see what this one cost. I'll show you that a little bit later. CO2 monitoring, you can monitor in the supply air. Don't see that a lot. Return air, that's pretty common. In the return air, and it can be a return air in the unit. It's more effective to be in the space or in a conference room is a great place to monitor CO2. I will tell you that this CO2 sensor that I'm holding up on right now, this CO2 sensor we've got at the beginning of the pandemic, we probably went out and bought about 10 of these. We have one in every conference room. It sits there and it just gives people, if they understand the CO2 in parts per million, it gives them some assurance or reassurance that we have enough ventilation air coming into the space. What could CO2 levels tell us? Pretty much just what I said. Is it a contaminant? No, but it is a surrogate. I might use that word again, surrogate. I think it does show up. It is widely accepted as a surrogate for fresh air. So your CO2 is low, your fresh air is good. Your CO2 gets high, you are probably lacking that fresh air, that turnover rate in the air system. What's the risk of breathing someone else's air? Well, if they're healthy, there's probably no risk at all, right? That's where we've got to be careful. If the parts per million are high and nobody is sick, I really don't mind. That doesn't bother me. I'm not going to catch anything if there's no dose. And that's why we talked about the dose briefly. Here's what OSHA lists for some information in terms of parts per million. I want to start out at the bottom. That's again is outdoor air. I'll use that as a background, a baseline, if you will. 400 parts per million. If you're 400 parts per million, you are basically in a similar condition as you are outdoors. I consider that to be very well ventilated. If you can match outdoor conditions, again, in places of the country where outdoor is good. 1,000 to 2,000 parts per million. Yeah, get complaints of drowsiness. Level associated above that, you can read again 40,000 at the very top. It can be harmful due to oxygen deprivation. Now, here's that same sensor I was showing you. This is just a typical readout. This one reads 570 parts per million. It was in a conference room with 2 people in it for 30 minutes. Time matters. Time is a huge factor when depending on whether or not the ventilation system is even on and at what rate you're bringing in outdoor air. But it gives you an idea of what it looks like. At the very bottom, 1,200 parts per million. I took at the risk of being considered a nerd, I take this thing with me about everywhere. It's a lot easier in the wintertime when you got a big coat. It doesn't look so obnoxious, but I'll set it right out on the table. And sometimes people ask me about it, sometimes they don't. I enjoy seeing where I also sent this on an airplane ride with somebody. I didn't know if TSA would stop them, and they did not. And they took it on an airplane ride. I don't remember the exact numbers for that. I wish I had that for you today. But what you can see at this restaurant is it started creeping up at 1,200 parts per million as time went on. And I just didn't stay past the 1 p.m. mark, but it was slowly rising. That is probably, if I look during the pandemic and suggest when was my behavior a little more risky than others, it would have been going to a restaurant, not knowing who these people are that I'm sitting around, that I'm rebreathing their air, if that makes sense. I hope it does. It's a little different than my family members, being around them when the numbers are high, which I will show you too. Here's the monitoring. I'm in no way advocating for this monitor, but I know some of you might be curious, what does this cost? I got this, I think, last night, the night before, something like that, and just pulled it off, put it in here. It had, like I said, we've got 10 or 12 of them. They have been very reliable, been very happy with them. You can probably get one for $40. I don't know what you would expect from it though. We also have one that's $600. These, just these little ones though, you can set them in a space and they'll trend log for you. You can plug them back into your computer and download what the levels look like at certain times. So just something to think about. Here's that CO2 sensor all over wherever I take it. The 404, I just walked in the back door from outside. So 404 is what I would expect. If you have a CO2 sensor and you can take it outdoors and you're not seeing right around 400, I would guess it probably needs to be recalibrated. In my pickup truck, driving down with the fan on, windows closed, 486. What I will tell you is I'll save that one a little bit later. I'm sorry, for the next slide. 2 people in a conference room, an office by myself. Yep, I'm rebreathing my own air. Am I concerned about it? No, I'm really not. And look at the one on the far right. So I did bring it home. I put it on the kitchen, on the cabinet, or the counter in the kitchen, and there were 8 people in there, and that was showing me one of the higher readings yet. I was actually feeling a little better about being at work than I was at home. However, I knew where most of those people had been, so I wasn't quite as concerned at the height of this pandemic. Again, it's where have people been? Whose air are you rebreathing? The next slide is for fun, but there's got to be a little bit of a personal story here. Karen and I are driving down the road, and I decided, because I take this with me everywhere, and I decided I'm going to take this thing out and I'm going to go ahead and start it, and I start reading it. On the far left-hand side, you see the CO2 sensor reaches 2,250 parts per million. If you look, I don't know, can you get, Lisa, can you see my pointer? Okay, so if you look on here, most of us probably have this button in our vehicle. This, by a chance, is about a 2020 Toyota Camry. And this recirculation button, neither of us touched it, but it happened to be on. And that recirculation button just basically says, we're not gonna bring in outdoor air. We're gonna save energy. Maybe we're avoiding odors that are outside because you're driving by, whatever. And so it's recirculating air. And after about 15 minutes, I said, I think this experiment is over, Karen. I think we need to stop this. I'm going to go ahead and hit that button. So you see in the middle one where the recirc button is off, and all of a sudden in 15 minutes, it's down to 640 parts per million. And another 15 minutes later goes down to 426 parts per million. The significance, while this was a little bit fun to take part in, and I really shocked me, I wasn't expecting anything like this. What it reminded me of is when you are driving and feeling drowsy, there could be a lot of different reasons why this is happening. But if your recirc is on, you are probably, go back to this on the OSHA, you just saw this a little bit ago. If you're operating someplace in this range, oh, sorry, get my pointer on here. If you're operating someplace in this range of 2,250, and I don't know where it would have gone, those are levels associated with headache, sleepiness, and loss of concentration. I think most of us have probably heard if you get tired, you know, roll the window down, do something like that. But there's something, I think, a lot more to it than that. You can keep that recirc off so that you're bringing in outdoor air. Hope that makes some sense. I think one last time looking at some of this outside air again, I think covered that well out. All right, here's a quiz. I'm not going to expect a single answer. I don't want to put anyone on the spot. CO2 levels are high. They indicate which of the following. The CO2 sensor in this room with me is reading 1500. Does it register how clean the air is? The likelihood of catching a disease from someone? All of the above or none of the above? The answer is D, none of the above. You cannot logically say just because you have high CO2 levels that you're going to catch anything from anybody because you don't know that anybody has anything. It's got to you've just got to take it for what it's worth. And it cannot tell you, it's just going to tell you CO2 levels. It doesn't tell you if there's, even if there's CO2 levels are low, it doesn't tell you that there's not another contaminant or not a contaminant somewhere in the space. So I hope that makes sense. CO2 levels can be affected by which of the following: activity in the space, the number of people in the space, the amount of breathed air, all of the above, none of the above, in this case, D, all of the above. When it comes to CO2, I also wanted to let you know that at this point in the presentation, if you're starting to feel drowsy, it's probably the CO2 level in your space, not this riveting presentation on CO2. That just has to go without saying. Talk about ventilation a little bit. ASHRAE 62.1 recommends the following for a typical office space. I think that's pretty well understood, but I do not want to take it lightly because there are a lot of spaces that don't meet that ventilation requirement. You will find those spaces out if you use a CO2 sensor. You'll just find out how well the spaces are ventilated, or they were designed to be ventilated, but the outdoor air damper is either stuck or closed in order to save money. Energy. ASHRAE position statement on infectious diseases, I think, is important to increase the outdoor air ventilation. You can read the rest of that stuff, but it's basically saying bring in enough outdoor air so that you can keep the people healthy inside. And that to us seems contradictory when we work so hard to save energy, so many things. So I put in this next slide for you because this next slide is going to be something that I think I don't really like the word cute, but this is about as close as it gets to that. 220, 200. This is numbers that I heard about 30 years ago, and it was, and I hate to say it, it dates me, but it was 110 and 100. And if you look at it, it's what I'm saying is about $2 a square foot can be used in energy in a typical building, used energy. Now, I know that we've got spaces that are running at 60 cents a square foot per year. And I should have said a per year. I put that on here too, a square foot per year. $20 per square foot per year for leased space. But take a look for, at what the actual occupancy is. At $200 per square foot for a wage salary earner, I always question whether or not that would be, what does that really turn out to be? So I went ahead and looked at our own office and said, basically for 33,000 square feet, 117 people, and then worked it out at the 200 rate. That was close to a total wage, salary, benefit package of about $56,000 a year. So if you have a space that has total package benefits package of $100,000 per year, you're going to be almost double the 200 mark. But that's not the point. The point is that the energy side of it, if you bring in more outdoor air, the energy side of it can be a very small part of it when you're looking at the safety of the employees, and also when you're looking at productivity. Because if you think about those, if you're spending 90% on the people, and your productivity of those people can go up by 3% because you're bringing in more ventilation air, that well outpaces the cost for energy. How you measure that, that's a whole another story. On the flip side, though, by reducing your ventilation rate and reducing performance, that can have a pretty drastic effect as well. This is a study that was done by the Lancet COVID-19 Commission, and it basically it was done for classrooms or for schools. I believe it was K-12, and it was really trying to make a point about ventilation. And in this case, an additional, if I look down to almost the last bullet item, an additional 1 liter per second increase, or about 20% increase over the 5 liters per second that it typically would have. The test scores, cognitive functions all went up. Asthma-related symptoms, missed days, absenteeisms, illnesses all went down. So the study, the more recent study has really just proven, I don't want to say proven, but it's really indicated that fresh air can make a big difference. How we translate that to the office space has yet to be exactly one for one, because classrooms, by the way, if you're at typical classrooms at about 5 liters per second, typical office might be at 2.5 liters per second. So again, that word carbon dioxide coming up is a surrogate. If your CO2 levels are high and you've got a lot of people in the space, you know that the accumulation of pollutants, body odors, that'll start to make a difference. We talked about productivity decreasing. Talked about increased absences. And I don't remember the study. About 1,000 parts per million CO2 above background has related in 10 to 20% increase in that absence rate. And I wish I had a source for you on that. I just can't remember what that was. Elevated rebreathe fraction rates as a percent. We'll look at that. Well, yeah, let's just look at that next. I do want you to know that as you breathe out about 36 to 38,000 parts per million. I could do that here. This thing will go from 750 to it's starting to spike. It's up to 1,300. It probably isn't the best for it, but it's over 3,000 right now. It's just know that on a CO2 basis, our parts per million, we breathe out a lot of parts per million. Here's what the rebreathe rate could look like. So right now, this is showing about 4,000 parts per million. If it were at 5,000, I would tell you, and that was what the room was like on a regular basis, 13% of the air that I breathe is probably my own breath coming back. And that only increases with time. Hopefully that makes some sense. You can do a lot of this. You can test rooms for CO2 with real-time monitoring, just like what I showed you. You can data log these rooms, determine how the HVAC system is keeping up, how well it is at removal of pollutants or contaminants. You can adjust the HVAC systems, this last item, when it specifically says mechanical engineers, I think what I really want to say is there's a lot more science to it. When we do clean rooms, USDA type clean rooms, or even laboratories where we're worried about unidirectional airflow, that can play a big part. I will tell you that I've been very fortunate to work on the ventilation systems like out at Prairie Meadows, where it's very unidirectional. We weren't worried about COVID 20 years ago, where we were worried about tobacco smoke. And so we specifically designed unidirectional flow to carry it up and out of the way as quickly as we could. When you look at that type of a system, operating suites are very similar, usually from a top down. Unidirectional flow can be another play, I guess, in terms of creating a better environment and less chance of rebreathing somebody else's air before it goes through a filter or something like that. I think you're going to see, about 10 years ago, we really saw more in terms of underfloor air delivery systems, UFAD, in the mechanical engineering side of things. I would say I'm fond of them in some areas, but not typical areas. I think something like that might, if we continue to put this much emphasis on the work environment, I could see something like that coming back. Now, filtration can go a lot of different ways, and it can be huge. I've only got the one slide on filtration. A general recommendation: use a MERV 13 filter. That's about a 90% filter. In the old days, that's what they were. How they were rated. If you're not familiar with MERV, M-E-R-V, I don't think I have that on there. MERV, M-E-R-V. That's minimum efficiency reporting value. It's an ASHRAE standard. I want to let you know what we did at Shive-Hattery. At the very beginning of this pandemic, we did really three things. We improved the filters in our air handling systems. We went to a MERV 13. We installed UV lights, UVC in particular. Some people will refer to them as filters. We've been working with them a long time in hospitals. And what we do know is UV, in the C range, it damages the nucleic acids and the proteins and viruses and bacteria, which really renders them useless. It doesn't kill them instantly, but it basically, they're unable to survive after that. But it's a very specific a wavelength, the UVC. The UVC does not, the C range for ultraviolet light does not typically make it through the ozone, so we don't see much of it at the ground level here, but you will in other places. In the air hand, it is not, it's got some safety issues that you need to be aware of. You never want to look at that UV light directly, and you got to be aware of that, but it does a very nice job of damaging bacteria as well as viruses. There's a study that just came out, and it was they looked at coronaviruses, what a 229E and OC43, two coronaviruses that have been causing the common cold. They've been linked to causing the common cold. So regardless of whether we're talking about COVID-19 or anything, all of this applies to just creating a healthier environment. That study recently showed that the UV lights, that UV will kill about 99.9% of those viruses in a 25-minute period. So pretty spectacular in that sense. Does it relate to SARS-CoV-2 directly? Not sure. That it's still, the jury's still out on that. And then the last thing is, really, if you look at this slide, this is a WinExtrude. This is a small residential style filtration system. We installed these in these little room units in different conference rooms. In some cases, we went through calculations to figure out what we needed in there in order to just have 2 people in a small conference room, or 3 people, or 4 people. And so these are, and again, I have no financial gain by showing you this or the CO2 recorders in any way whatsoever. I just wanted to share with you something that might be practical. I did go to a place that sounds a lot like POSCO, but starts with a different letter. Yeah, thank you very much, Lisa. I appreciate that. And I bought 3 of these units and put them in my house just to, it's not gonna, didn't figure it's gonna hurt anything. And but they have been good units. And by the way, and we've got about 10 of these at our office, 2 in some of the smaller conference rooms. So just something to be aware of. I briefly mentioned the use of time, and this is about our last slide. This is with the half-life on most viruses, or on all viruses, living organisms, Time can be of use from the dose point of view, but when you're trying to flush out a space, figure out the recovery rate for a room, you can do that with the CO2 sensor in that space. If you have 5 people in there, you watch those 5 people leave, and after so much time, that room should be back to whatever you want to call normal CO2 levels. So use that. Use the portable monitors that are available. And sometimes you just have to structure room schedules with breaks throughout the day. Big rooms can take a lot of people sometimes, but you don't want to run them like that all day long. So here's some resources. If you do take your phone now and put the camera up to that QR code, it will take you to some resources that we talked about and take you to some other things. There's a lot of videos out there on this kind of stuff. I find them pretty fascinating, but that's pretty much what I wanted to share with you on the presentation. We're at 12:42. Lisa, do you see any questions or anything?
Not yet, but people feel free to jump in and ask any questions that you might have.
Chris, I'm a retired FM, but your comment about sort of leaving breathing, I don't know what you call it, but basically not schedule conference rooms back to back to allow them to recover. It's one of those things that once you mention it, you sort of say to yourself, well, yeah, but you never really thought of it that way. And I think not only with, one of the things we found is people are being more careful now, generally wearing masks. My wife and I have been less ill than we normally have. My wife will normally have 3 or 4 ear infections a year, and she's had like 1. And it's just thinking about stuff like that, I think. It was a very interesting presentation.
Thank you. Yeah, with the conference rooms, Rod, I think Lisa and I could tell you there's one conference room that recovers slower than our other conference rooms. Mm. There's one and only one reason that is because that doesn't have as much ventilation air. Right. Before COVID, we didn't care. We didn't know. We cared, but it was, there's somebody on some plan said, here, you get 60 CFM of fresh air and so forth and so on. Now, these kind of tools will give you some sort of it gives you some feedback. And I'm telling you, even in the car, I didn't even finish this one up, Rod, but the plane, I told you I sent this with one of our architects on a plane ride to Las Vegas. I don't remember the exact numbers, but he took a measurement while they're sitting there at the before they're pushed back, and they've still got the big air hose on them. And it was reading, my recollection, it was reading right around 650 parts per million. Well, that doesn't bother me so much. Granted, you're in there with a lot of strangers, and I know you don't know where they've been, right. and what you're breathing, and once they got rolling down the taxi, and then they started rolling, flying. He even recorded, whatever at 30,000 feet. And it was close to 1,200, 1,300. It was close to that restaurant. And until we kind of understand some of this, that it is science there, and we got to do some stuff to interpret it. I think, if you're comfortable wearing a mask and the mask is effective, I don't see, that changing on a plane ride necessarily. You're really exposing yourself to some stuff on a plane ride in that sense, in my mind. Yeah. But if everyone's healthy, it's no big deal.
And we just haven't thought about it before.
Yeah. Or the car ride. I know I've been drowsy driving before. I really behave differently now. I will roll that window down and I'll get a second breath of air.
Well, it's also comforting to know that the reason people got sleepy in my presentations over the years was because of high levels of carbon dioxide instead of the quality of my presentation.
That's exactly it.
Oh boy.
I love it. Anybody else? Any questions?
You know, Chris, you talk about MERV 13. When COVID first hit, one of the first places in Iowa that had an outbreak was on with Life in Ankeny. And well, she was actually a good friend of our daughter's, but we know her mom and dad pretty well too. She was out there and was begging for masks. So my wife, who's a seamstress, went online, found patterns, and used up a bunch of her scrap fabric to make masks. But with every one of those double layer fabric masks, we ripped apart a MERV 13 furnace filter and used the filtration fabric in the mask. So we had MERV 13 filters essentially in the mask, the cloth mask.
Wow.
Yeah. And I'll tell you what, tearing apart one of those furnace filters isn't as easy as you might think it would be.
No, I've never even thought of that, Rod, but that is, I mean, that's the science, applying the science of the MERV 13s. Yeah, absolutely.
Right.
I would say you're in less than the 1 percentile that ever thought of doing something like that. Way less than, but very, very good. Very,
Yeah.
very good. Any other questions, comments? Anybody surprised about the car? Driving around in a car and it gets up that high? I mean, that to me.
Yeah, Chris, I mean, super great information. And one thing I never even considered is the fact that of how this just impacts you on an every single day basis. And some of those super simple things like, you know, the recirculation in your vehicle, the difference that makes. I mean, just really, really, really interesting stuff. Thank you.
You're welcome. And we do the same thing with our air handling systems in a building.
Yep.
Well, oftentimes, well, you know, they'll recirc all night long, when actually in the summertime, when it's coolest at night, maybe what we do, I didn't even write that down because it wasn't a filtration, but we just flush our systems out all night long in our office and try just to get rid of as many contaminants of any kind as we can. So it does change the way we look at it. I think knowing we're going to spend more energy, we've got to start looking a little bit differently on how to now reduce that energy profile even under these new circumstances, because I do think it's going to be here to stay.
Yeah.
And none of you probably remember, I mean, I remember the 1970s, but I wasn't designing then, but we built tight buildings and we closed outdoor air dampers because there was a thing called the energy crisis. And the energy crisis caused us to really save as much money as we can. I think we can all appreciate that right now, even with gas prices and everything. But what did it do? It created sick building syndrome.
Mm-hmm.
Created issues down the road because we tighten the buildings up too much. We know this. We know better than this, and yet we still sometimes fail to put the right stuff in buildings that are operated that way. Any other questions? What else?
Well, back in that day, Chris, we did remember the super insulated houses.
Oh yeah.
You know, and there were problems with them because no one had been able to invent an energy flywheel that you could, you know, they always froze up in colder climates. And now we've got the technology to do that, but we really didn't know. We did know, we just didn't think about it.
Right. Yep. It's usually issues like this that create something better for us down the road. It really does. Take something like this to make that happen though.
All right, well, good stuff, Chris. Thank you for taking your time today to present all this really interesting and useful information. Yeah. Thanks, everybody, for joining us.
Thanks, everyone. Bye.
Thank you. Thanks, Chris.
You're welcome.